first light of dawn touched the valley of the Apachu with a soft, golden breath. Mist still lingered above the river, weaving through the tall reeds and bending gently against the morning wind. From the highest ridge, where stones glimmered faintly with dew, the sound of slow drums echoed, not loud or commanding, but steady, like the heartbeat of the land itself. For countless generations, the Apachu had lived in harmony with this valley, a land of whispering grasses, winding rivers, and ancient plateaus that remembered the footsteps of their ancestors. Their villages rested among terraces carved into the slopes, where water flowed through channels of polished stone. Every stream, every rock, every rustle of the wind carried a memory, and the people listened. For the Apachu, listening was not a task. It was a way of being. At the edge of the village stood Amaru, a woman of calm, strength, and steady presence. Her hair was braided with strands of river grass, her eyes reflecting the same quiet depth as the morning waters. She held a small bowl filled with spring water and fragments of obsidian. And as the first rays of light touched the valley, she whispered an invocation in a language that carried the rhythm of the earth. May the river breathe. May the stones remember. May our steps follow their pulse. The Apachu believed that the world spoke through rhythm. The wind was its voice, the river its memory, the fire its transformation. Every dawn began with silence, followed by song, not to summon the day, but to join it. So as Amaru's voice faded, others joined, low hums, layered tones, and gentle percussions of wood and shell. The valley seemed to listen and respond. The mist thinned, the water shimmered, and the birds began to call from the terraces. Amaru turned toward the rising sun, her breath slow and even. She carried with her the memory of her mother, who had performed the same ritual before her, and her mother's mother before that. Each generation added something to the song, a new rhythm, a new phrase, a new memory. And in this way, the Apachu's story had never been written in stone or parchment, but woven into sound, air, and breath. From the upper ridge came a young boy, Tyan, carrying a bundle of dried herbs and pine resin. His steps were careful, his balance light, for the path was steep and still damp from night dew. When he reached Amaru, he bowed slightly and placed the bundle beside her. Without words, she sprinkled the resin into the fire pit before her, and smoke rose in gentle spirals, drifting toward the sky. The scent filled the air, sweet, sharp, grounding. Today, Amaru said quietly, "We remember the first journey of the river." Tyan nodded, though he did not yet understand. He had heard stories of the river's origin, that it had once flowed from a single spring at the heart of the world, and that its water carried the songs of stars. The elders said that those who listened deeply could still hear those songs beneath the surface of the current. Amaru believed this was not myth, but memory, the land remembering itself through sound. They walked together toward the river. Along the banks, reeds swayed in rhythm, and stones glistened under the sun's new warmth. Amaru knelt, dipping her hand into the cool water. "This river," she said softly, "has seen more than any elder. It has carried our joys, our grief, and our silence. It knows the faces of those who walked before us." Tyan knelt beside her. "Can it remember me too?" he asked. Amaru smiled, her reflection rippling across the water. "Yes," she said, "if you walk with care." If you listen, if you breathe with the rhythm of this land, it will remember you. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then a gust of wind moved through the valley, brushing across the reeds and stirring the surface of the river. The ripples shimmered like woven light, and Tayan thought he saw faint patterns forming, spirals and circles, fading as quickly as they appeared. It was as if the river itself were speaking, though its language was older than any word. As the morning unfolded, more villagers gathered by the water, elders with faces marked by time, and youth with eager eyes formed a circle. They carried baskets of seeds, clay vessels, and carved stones, offerings of gratitude to the valley. The drums began again, their rhythm slow and grounding. Voices rose, blending in harmony, each tone finding its place among the others. The Apachu did not sing to worship, they sang to remember. Every note carried a fragment of history, the arrival of rain after a long drought, the birth of a child, the passing of a loved one. Through song, they restored balance between what had been and what was yet to come. Amaru closed her eyes and felt the pulse of the earth beneath her knees. It was steady, ancient, alive. By midday, the ritual came to a quiet end. The villagers left the riverbank in silence, carrying with them the rhythm of the day. Amaru remained, gazing at her reflection in the obsidian bowl. In its dark surface, she saw more than her own face. She saw movement, depth, and the shimmer of something beyond sight. The mirror did not show the future or the past, but the continuity between them. The valley was still. Only the faint murmur of the river broke the silence. Amaru breathed deeply and whispered to the wind, "May we continue to remember. May our presence be gentle." The wind carried her words across the water, into the distance, where ridge and sky met in quiet unity. Above, a hawk circled slowly, its shadow gliding over the earth like a passing thought. The first day of the new season had begun, and with it, the Apachu renewed their covenant with the valley, to live with care, to listen deeply, and to walk as part of the land's enduring song. The drums faded, the light softened, and the memory of the dawn lingered, not in words, but in the breath of every living thing that called the valley home. The afternoon sun hung gently above the valley, and the air shimmered with a quiet warmth. The Apachu village lay in stillness. Only the soft murmur of water and the rhythmic tapping of weaving looms filled the air. Each sound, each breath, each pause carried meaning. For the Apachu, silence was not emptiness. It was listening. Amaru sat near the great river Tanu Yara, a stream so ancient that the elders said its waters remembered the songs of creation. Her hands rested on her knees, palms open, her eyes fixed on the flowing current. The river was calm today, its surface smooth as polished stone, reflecting clouds that drifted lazily across the sky. To most eyes, it was simply water, clear, cool, moving endlessly toward the distant lowlands. But to Amaru, it was a living voice. She closed her eyes and let her breathing match the rhythm of the current. Inhale, the river draws in life. Exhale, it releases the memory of mountains. The Apachu had long believed that the river carried the thoughts of the land. What the earth could not speak through wind or stone, it whispered through water. Listen closely, Amaru's grandmother had once told her, and the river will tell you stories that no voice can hold. But it speaks in rhythm, not in words. Now, years later, Amaru felt the truth of those teachings more deeply than ever. The world was alive with memory, and her task was to tend it, to ensure that the Apachu never forgot how to listen. She dipped her hand into the river, feeling the coolness wrap around her fingers. Beneath the surface, the current moved steadily, pressing against her palm with the faint strength of a pulse. For a brief moment, she felt it, not merely the movement of water, but a gentle vibration, a hum that resonated through her bones. It was like a song, or perhaps the echo of one. Behind her, footsteps approached. Tyan, the young boy who had joined her that morning, came carrying a clay vessel filled with fresh herbs. He knelt beside her quietly. "Elder Emaru," he said softly, "the water sounds different today." She smiled without opening her eyes. "How so?" she asked. "It feels like it's saying something," he replied. Tyan replied, his voice uncertain, "like it's calling." Amaru opened her eyes then, gazing at the boy. His expression was earnest, filled with curiosity that had not yet learned fear. "Perhaps it is," she said gently. "The river calls to those who are ready to listen. It carries messages not from others, but from within." She motioned for him to place his hands in the water. The boy obeyed, wincing at the cold, and then went still. They sat together in silence, the sunlight glinting off the surface of the river. A soft breeze moved through the reeds, carrying the faint scent of wild sage. Birds chirped in the distance, their songs punctuating the rhythm of the flowing water. "What do you feel?" Amaru asked quietly. Tyan hesitated. "It's moving, but it doesn't feel like it's going anywhere." "It feels like it's circling." Amaru nodded. "Yes, the river flows forward, but its psalm circles. Memory does not move in a straight line. It returns always to where it began." The boy frowned slightly, trying to understand. "Then, if the river remembers everything, does it remember us?" "It remembers all who have walked gently," she said. "Every footstep that touched its banks with care, every hand that thanked it, every song that was sung beside it, all become part of its breath. The careless steps wash away, but the careful ones endure." Tyan looked at his reflection in the water. "Then I want it to remember me," he said softly. Amaru's eyes softened. "It already does," she replied, "because you listened." For a long while, they sat in silence, the sound of the river surrounding them like a quiet heartbeat. The sun drifted westward, its light growing warmer, painting the world in gold. Across the water, dragonflies darted between reeds, their wings glinting with the colors of the sky. Everything seemed perfectly balanced. Motion and stillness, sound and silence, memory and forgetting. When they rose to leave, Amaru turned toward the mountains that framed the valley. In their shadowed faces, she saw shapes that reminded her of sleeping giants, the guardians of time, the keepers of what once was. "Come," she said, "there is more to hear." They followed a narrow trail that wound along the river's edge. The path was lined with stones engraved by generations past, spirals, lines, and patterns that mirrored the flow of the current. Each carving was a record, a silent song etched into earth. The Apachu did not write in words. They wrote in rhythm, in marks that only the river could fully understand. At a bend in the path, they came to an ancient oak tree, its roots clutching the riverbank, like the hands of an elder holding fast to memory. Beneath its branches, stood a small altar of smooth stones, arranged in a perfect circle. In the center rested a single piece of obsidian, polished to a mirror-like sheen. The stone reflected the water beside it, as if the river were gazing into itself. "This," Amaru said, "is where the river listens back." She knelt before the altar, gesturing for Tyann to do the same. Together, they placed their hands upon the stones. The surface was warm from the sun, but beneath that warmth, Amaru could feel a faint hum, the echo of countless offerings, countless whispers of gratitude carried by her people across time. "Speak your name," she instructed softly. Tyann hesitated, then whispered, "Tyann." "Now listen." They waited. The breeze softened, the hum of the river deepened, and for a moment, Tyann thought he heard his name again, not from his own lips, but from the earth itself. The sound was faint, like an echo from a great distance, yet it carried warmth, recognition, and peace. Amaru opened her eyes and looked at him. "You see," she said gently, "the river remembers." The boy's eyes were wide, his heart beating fast. "Is it magic?" he asked. "No," she said, smiling. "It is memory. And memory is the oldest kind of magic there is." The sun began to sink behind the mountains, and the valley filled with the golden light of evening. Shadows stretched long across the terraces, and the sound of the river grew softer, deeper, as if it were preparing to sleep. Amaru rose, brushing the dust from her knees. "Come," she said. "Tomorrow we will listen to the stones." Tyann looked once more at the water, before following her. The current sparkled in the fading light, whispering softly as it moved. Though he could not yet understand its language, he felt a quiet promise in its voice, that one day, when he had learned to listen as deeply as Amaru, he too would hear the full song of the valley. And so the river whispered on, carrying the stories of the Apachu, through time, through silence and sound, through birth and loss, through memory and renewal, never ending, never beginning, only continuing. The morning after the river's whisper dawned clear and cool. Mist drifted above the terraces, like the breath of sleeping spirits, and every blade of grass shone with dew. The valley of the Apachu stirred slowly, as if reluctant to wake from a sacred dream. Smoke rose from hearths, thin and blue, mingling with the scent of damp earth and wild sage. The river murmured softly nearby, an ancient song greeting the light of a new day. Amaru walked quietly through the village, her steps deliberate, her expression serene. In her hand she carried a smooth, dark stone, a gift from the river, found the night before where the current curved around a cluster of reeds. It was small enough to fit in her palm, yet heavy, dense with a kind of silent gravity. Its surface was cool and perfectly round, as though shaped by centuries of water's patience. Tyann followed a few steps behind, his eyes full of curiosity. "Is that the stone that listens?" he asked softly. Amaru smiled faintly. "No," she replied. "This one speaks." They left the village behind and climbed a narrow path that led toward the eastern ridge. The path wound upward through groves of cedar and mesquite, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Sunlight filtered through the branches in golden threads, painting moving patterns across the ground. Each step brought them closer to a place few visited, The Circle of Stones, a sacred clearing where the Apachu came to listen to the memory of the earth itself. When they reached the crest, Tyann gasped. Before them lay a broad, flat plateau overlooking the entire valley. From here, they could see everything. The silver ribbon of the river winding below, the terraces carved into the hillsides, the smoke rising from the morning fires. In the center of the plateau stood 12 great stones, each taller than a person, arranged in a perfect circle. Their surfaces were marked with spirals, lines, and faint carvings that shimmered faintly when the sunlight touched them. Amaru stepped into the circle and placed the small river stone in its center. The air changed. It grew still, dense, as if holding its breath. Even the wind quieted, waiting. "This is where the land remembers most clearly," Amaru said softly. "The circle listens to every word, every song, every silence spoken within it. But sometimes, when the balance is right, it also answers." Tyann swallowed. "How?" Amaru knelt beside the stone and gestured for him to do the same. "With patience," she said, "with stillness." They sat cross-legged within the circle, their palms resting lightly on the earth. The stones loomed around them, ancient and immovable, their presence both solemn and gentle. Amaru closed her eyes and began to hum, a low, steady tone that blended with the breath of wind and the murmur of the river below. Her voice seemed to ripple through the air, touching the surface of each standing stone in turn. The sound lingered, vibrating faintly, then faded into silence. "Now," she whispered, "we listen." At first, there was nothing, only the faint hiss of wind between rocks. But slowly, Tyann began to hear something deeper, a resonance that seemed to rise from the ground itself. It was not a voice, not words, but a pulse, low and rhythmic, like the beating of a distant heart. The boy felt it in his bones. It was steady, ancient, and impossibly vast. "The earth speaks in rhythms," Amaru said quietly, her eyes still closed. "Each stone, each grain of soil carries a memory. The trick is not to understand the words, but to feel their balance." The hum grew stronger, surrounding them in invisible waves. The standing stones shimmered faintly, their carvings glowing like the last embers of a dying fire. Patterns of light and shadow played across the ground, spirals, circles, waves, echoing the shapes carved into the rock. It was as if the plateau itself were breathing. Tyann's heart pounded. He opened his mouth to speak, but Amaru raised a hand, signaling for silence. He obeyed, breathing slowly, his senses open. Beneath the hum, he began to hear something else, a faint whisper, softer than a sigh, carried through the vibrations of the stones. It was a sound both familiar and foreign, like an echo of his own heartbeat, answering him from far below. "What is it saying?" he asked finally, barely above a whisper. Amaru opened her eyes. "It says what it has always said. We remember." The boy frowned slightly. "Who remembers?" "The land, the water, the stones, and us, when we listen." She reached out and touched the stone at her side. "These stones were placed here by our ancestors when the first fires were lit. They mark not boundaries, but relationships. Each stone holds a memory of a season, a birth, a flood, a prayer. When we come here, We do not ask for answers. We remind the land that we have not forgotten. Tyen looked around the circle. Do they always speak? Amaru smiled faintly. Only when the silence is deep enough to hear. The boy lowered his gaze, closing his eyes again. The wind brushed gently through his hair, carrying the scent of cedar and distant rain. Beneath the surface of sound, he felt the rhythm once more. Strong, steady, kind. It pulsed through the ground, through his hands, through his breath. In that moment, he felt small, but not insignificant. A single heartbeat in the greater body of the world. After some time, Amaru rose, brushing dust from her robe. That is enough for today, she said softly. The stones speak slowly. They prefer those who return. Tyen stood as well, glancing one last time at the circle. The small river stone still lay at its center, glinting faintly in the sunlight. He thought he saw it tremble, just slightly, as if breathing. As they descended the ridge, the sound of the river grew stronger once more. Elder, he asked, why do the stones remember but not speak clearly? Amaru smiled. Because clarity belongs to those who wait. The land speaks in its own language, through time, through patience. To understand, we must learn not to ask, but to be. They walked in silence for a long while. The valley stretched before them, green, fertile, alive. The air shimmered with the promise of afternoon warmth. In the distance, children laughed, and the sound wove itself into the greater rhythm of the valley, a music without beginning or end. That night, as the stars filled the sky, Tyen lay awake beside the river, listening. He placed his hand on the ground, feeling the faint hum of the earth beneath him. It was still there, the same slow, steady rhythm that had spoken to him in the circle. For the first time, he felt its presence, not as something outside himself, but within. The stones, he realized, were not speaking to him. They were speaking through him. And somewhere in the darkness, Amaru smiled, knowing he had begun to hear. Night settled softly over the valley of the Apachu, wrapping the land in a calm, amber hush. The last light of day slipped behind the western ridge, leaving streaks of red and gold in the sky, the colors of warmth, of fire, of transformation. In the heart of the village, a single flame flickered in the ceremonial pit, breathing gently like a sleeping heart. Fire, among the Apachu, was more than light or heat. It was the breath of life itself, the living bridge between what was and what could be. It carried memory upward, transforming offerings of earth into smoke that touched the sky. Every flame, no matter how small, was treated with reverence. The people said that each spark carried a story, and that when the smoke rose, the ancestors listened. Amaru knelt beside the fire, her shadow long and graceful against the packed earth. Around her, villagers gathered in a quiet circle. Elders wrapped in woven cloaks, children resting their heads on their mothers' laps. Hunters and artisans sitting shoulder to shoulder. In the center of the circle burned the communal flame, built from cedar, sage, and dried river reeds. Its scent filled the air, sweet and ancient. Tyen sat close to Amaru, his face illuminated by the warm glow. The day's teaching still lingered in his mind. The voice of the river, the pulse of the stones. Yet something in the fire drew him deeper, calling to a place within him he had not known before. It danced with purpose, never still, its movements alive with meaning. Amaru reached into a small bowl beside her, filled with powdered ochre and crushed herbs. She sprinkled the mixture into the flames, and immediately the fire flared bright blue, then softened into shimmering waves of green and gold. The circle fell silent. Only the crackle of the fire spoke, sharp, steady, alive. The fire, Amaru began, her voice steady and calm, does not destroy. It remembers through change. When the earth grows cold, it brings warmth. When darkness comes, it brings vision. When our voices fade, it carries them upward. Fire is the breath between worlds. Her words flowed like the rhythm of wind through reeds. The villagers listened with still hearts. The crackling flame cast moving patterns on their faces, a dance of light and shadow that mirrored the balance of life itself. Amaru continued, "Our ancestors taught us that fire was once hidden beneath the earth. It slept in stone, dreaming of light. Then came the first storm, and the heavens struck the mountains. We are born from its warmth and return to its breath." Tyann watched the spiral glow, his eyes wide with wonder. "Elder," he asked softly, "does the fire speak like the stones in the river?" Amaru smiled, her eyes reflecting the flame. "Yes," she said, "but its voice is louder. It speaks not through patience, but through transformation. Fire does not whisper. It teaches by becoming." She lifted a small piece of wood from the fire and held it aloft. Sparks leapt upward, carried by the wind. "Each spark is a memory returning to the stars," she said. "Each ember a promise to the earth." The villagers hummed softly, low, steady tones that matched the rhythm of the crackling flame. Their song had no words, only breath and sound, rising and falling like the fire's pulse. The melody wound through the circle, gentle yet powerful. The Apachu sang not to summon spirits, but to remind themselves that they were part of the great rhythm of existence, a rhythm shared by river, stone, and flame alike. Amaru placed the burning branch back into the pit. "Fire reminds us that all things change," she said. "To resist change is to resist life. To accept it is to honor the breath that moves through all things." Tyann thought of the river's flow, of the hum of the stones, and now of the fire's dance. Each element spoke differently, yet their messages intertwined. Movement, memory, transformation. He understood now that the teachings of the Apachu were not many lessons, but one continuous song expressed in many forms. The elders began to tell stories then. Ancient tales passed from voice to voice, generation to generation. One elder spoke of the first fire, who had guided lost travelers through endless storms. Another told of a flame so gentle it healed the sick by its warmth. Each story carried a lesson, that destruction and creation were not opposites, but partners, that the same fire which burns the forest also prepares the soil for renewal. Amaru listened, her eyes half closed, her expression serene. When the last story ended, she rose and extended her hands over the fire. "We give thanks," she whispered, "for the breath that sustains us, the warmth that protects us, and the memory that binds us to all that is." The villagers followed, raising their palms toward the flame. Together they exhaled slowly, a single breath offered to the night. The fire flickered once, then blazed brighter, as though inhaling their gratitude. A wave of warmth spread outward, brushing their faces like a gentle wind. Then, slowly, The flame steadied again, its pulse soft and calm. The stars had fully emerged by now, scattered like grains of light across the dark sky. Their reflections shimmered in the river nearby, where the current moved like liquid glass. Tyan gazed up at them, feeling a stillness settle in his chest. The fire, he said quietly, is like the stars. Amaru turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, she said. They are both the breath of the same memory, one burning above, the other below. When we look upon them, we remember that we are made of both earth and sky. The fire crackled softly in agreement. The villagers began to drift away, their shadows merging with the darkness. Soon, only Amaru and Tyan remained beside the flame. She placed another branch into the pit, then lowered her voice. Remember Tyan, she said. The river teaches how to listen. The stones teach how to wait. But the fire teaches how to change without losing yourself. Tyan nodded slowly, committing her words to memory. The flame shimmered, reflecting in his eyes. He felt its warmth, not just on his skin, but deep within. A living presence, bright and infinite. When they finally stood to leave, Amaru took a burning ember from the pit and sealed it inside a clay bowl. The night must never forget its heart, she said. The flame sleeps, but it does not die. Together they carried the ember back to the riverbank, where they placed it beside the flowing water. The red glow reflected softly on the current. Two forces side by side, one of motion, one of transformation, each whispering to the other. The wind shifted, gentle and warm, and Amaru smiled. Now, she said, the valley breathes as one. The moon rose slowly above the valley, silver and immense, bathing the land of the Apachu in a quiet light. The air was cool and still. The wind had ceased its wandering, and even the river seemed to move more gently, as though it too wished to listen. Shadows stretched long and soft across the terraces, and the faint sound of night birds echoed from the distant cliffs. Amaru stood by the riverbank, her cloak drawn around her shoulders. The ember she had carried from the village fire still glowed faintly in the clay bowl beside her, its warmth pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Across the water, the moon's reflection shimmered, unbroken and whole. It was as if the heavens had bent to rest upon the river. Tyan sat nearby, his knees drawn to his chest. He had been silent for a long time, watching the reflection of the moon ripple each time the current moved. There was a deep calm around him, but also a quiet tension, a feeling that the world was waiting for something unspoken. Elder, he said finally, his voice barely louder than the whisper of the wind. Why does the moon look so close tonight? Amaru smiled faintly. Because you are looking with the kind of eyes that see, she said. When the heart listens, the distance between heaven and earth grows small. Pause. She knelt beside the ember and stirred it gently with a thin branch. Sparks rose into the air like small stars, rising, then fading into the night. Each spark, she murmured, is a memory returning home. Some reach the stars, some return to us in dreams. Pause. Tyan tilted his head. Dreams? Pause. Yes, she said softly. When we sleep, our spirits travel the same paths the fire takes. We move through memory. The moon watches over those journeys. Pause. It guides the wandering parts of our hearts back to the body by morning. She looked up, her face calm in the moonlight. Tonight, the moon is full. Its light reaches into every shadow. It shows what is hidden. Listen carefully, Tayan. This is the night when the valley remembers its oldest song. He frowned slightly, uncertain if he understood, but he did as she said. He closed his eyes and breathed with the rhythm of the river. For a moment, there was nothing, only the sound of water and the beating of his heart. Then faintly, he heard it, a low hum, distant yet familiar, rising from the earth itself. It was the same tone he had felt beneath the stones, the same rhythm that moved within the river's flow. But tonight, it carried something more. A voice, faint but clear, weaving through the hum like light through mist. He opened his eyes quickly. "Elder," he whispered, "I think I hear it." Amaru nodded, her expression serene. "You are hearing what most forget," she said. "The land is always speaking, but the world is loud with human noise. Only when we fall silent does it find us again." The sound deepened. It moved through the valley like a slow heartbeat, resonating in every stone, every blade of grass. The river responded, its surface shimmering with soft waves that caught the moonlight like silver threads. Even the air seemed to tremble slightly, filled with invisible rhythm. Then, just for an instant, the reflection of the moon wavered and split. Two moons shimmered side by side upon the water. Tayan gasped softly, but Amaru did not move. "Do not fear," she said. "When the world speaks clearly, its reflections multiply. The earth shows us more than one truth at a time." The boy's breath quickened. He stared at the twin moons until they slowly merged again into one. "Was that real?" he asked. Amaru smiled gently. "Reality is not a single shape. It is a circle that shifts with the light." For a while, they watched the current flow in silence. Then Amaru rose and walked toward the great oak tree that grew near the bend in the river, the same one beneath which they had spoken to the listening stone. The moonlight gathered around its roots, turning them pale and luminous. She placed her hand upon the bark and whispered a few words in the old tongue. Tayan could not understand the language, but the tone filled him with calm. It was not a chant, nor a prayer, but a conversation, one that had been happening for centuries, between people and the living world. He saw the way the branches trembled as if in answer, and he knew the tree heard her. When Amaru turned back, her eyes glimmered with reflected light. "Long ago," she said, "our ancestors stood here and promised the valley they would never take without giving. That promise lives in us." But promises fade if not spoken aloud again. She knelt and touched the ground with both palms. "Tonight," she said softly, "we remind the land." Tayan hesitated, then mirrored her gesture. His hands pressed against the cool earth. Beneath his fingertips, he felt the faintest vibration, a rhythm pulsing slow and steady, like a quiet breath. It was not sound, not movement, but presence. And within that presence, he sensed something vast. A consciousness that extended far beyond the valley, reaching through water and stone and sky. He felt a tear slip down his cheek, though he could not say why. It was not sadness, but recognition, the feeling of something ancient and kind returning home. Amaru opened her eyes and spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. "The river carries the memory of time. The stones hold the patience of the earth. The fire teaches us how to change. And the moon teaches us how to reflect. As she spoke, the ember in the clay bowl flickered. Its light grew stronger for a moment, then dimmed to a steady, gentle glow. The fire listens too, she said quietly. It remembers every breath we give it. That is why we keep it alive, so that our words do not vanish. Tayan nodded, his voice trembling with awe. Elder, will the land always remember us? Amaru's gaze turned toward the horizon, where the mountains met the stars. Only if we continue to remember it, she said. The land forgets those who forget themselves. The boy looked down at the reflection of the moon in the river once more. It shone perfectly still now, whole and unbroken. He realized then that the river, the stones, the fire, the moon, they were all parts of the same story, and that he himself was a word within it. The night deepened. Crickets began their song, and the wind returned, soft and cool. The ember in the bowl pulsed one final time before settling into a quiet red glow. Amaru placed the lid gently over it and whispered, "Sleep, but do not fade." The valley exhaled, a soft breath of peace moving through grass and water alike. Above, the moon continued its slow passage across the sky, patient and eternal. Its light touched every corner of the valley. The terraces, the circle of stones, the roofs of the village, and finally the faces of Amaru and Tayan by the river. Neither spoke again that night. They simply sat together, listening to the hum of the earth, to the pulse of the river, and to the faint, eternal rhythm that connected them to everything. When the dawn came, they would carry that rhythm with them, as every generation of the Apachu had before. For memory, like the river, had no end. The dawn came with a restless wind. It swept through the valley of the Apachu like a messenger who had traveled far, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the faint cry of unseen birds. The tall grasses bent beneath its passage, and the waters of the river rippled in long silver lines. Above, the clouds drifted in slow spirals, their shapes changing with every breath of air. It was the kind of morning that whispered of change. Amaru stood at the edge of the terrace, her cloak fluttering gently behind her. The horizon burned gold where the sun began to rise, and the first rays of light spilled across the sleeping village. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. The air was cool, alive, filled with the promise of movement. "The winds are returning," she murmured. "It is time." For generations, the Apachu had watched the sky for signs of the turning season, the time when the winds shifted direction, bringing new life to the valley. It marked the end of stillness and the beginning of renewal. Each turning carried its own message, and the elders believed that those who listened closely could hear what the world wished to say. As the village awoke, the sound of the wind grew stronger. Doors opened, children's laughter rose from the courtyards, and the scent of cedar smoke drifted into the morning air. The Apachu were a people who lived in harmony with rhythm. The rhythm of seasons, of water, of wind. They did not fight change, they prepared for it. And this dawn, it seemed, carried the rhythm of something larger than any they had felt before. Tayan emerged from his dwelling and lifted his face toward the sky. The wind rushed through his hair, cool and wild, and he felt his heart stir with energy he could not name. For nights, he had dreamed of the river glowing beneath the moon, of embers that whispered his name. He had seen visions of mountains with eyes of fire and forests that sang without sound. The dreams left him both exhilarated and uncertain. Now standing beneath the moving sky, he wondered if they had been warnings or invitations. Amaru joined him, her steps slow and sure. She carried a carved staff wrapped in river reeds, the symbol of her role as keeper of balance. "You feel it, don't you?" she said. He nodded. "It feels like the air itself is alive." "It is," she said. "The wind remembers paths that we have forgotten. It travels where we cannot. When it returns, it brings with it echoes from distant places. That is why we listen to it, not for its noise, but for its memory." The young apprentice tilted his head, letting the wind rush past his ears. There was a sound within it, faint but deliberate, like a whisper carried from afar. He could almost make out a rhythm, a pattern, though it faded each time he tried to grasp it. "It feels familiar," he said. Amaru's eyes softened, "because it carries the breath of those who came before us. Every turning of the wind is a reminder that nothing truly vanishes. The voices of our ancestors move through air and time, returning to us when the world is ready to listen again." She turned her gaze toward the mountains that framed the valley. Clouds gathered there, drifting low and slow. "Do you see how the wind gathers?" she asked. "That means the highlands call to us. It is time to renew the paths of offering." Tayan's heart quickened. The paths of offering were sacred routes leading from the valley to the higher peaks, where the Apachu left gifts of stone, grain, and fire to honor the spirits of the land. It had been many seasons since a full pilgrimage had been made. "Will we go there?" he asked. Amaru nodded. "Yes. The wind tells us that the mountains wait. But before we go, we must prepare the village, not with haste, but with harmony. The journey is not only across land. It is through memory." As they spoke, others began to gather near the terraces. The elders stood in quiet circles, their faces turned toward the sky. Hunters checked their tools, artisans tied bundles of woven cloth, and children chased the wind between the houses, laughing as their hair whipped across their faces. The valley, alive with motion, seemed to breathe. By midday, the air had grown warmer, but the wind did not rest. It moved in spirals through the fields, wafting dust and seeds into glowing arcs of light. Amaru and Tayan worked beside the others, collecting herbs for the journey: sage, mint, and the pale blossoms of river lilies. The plants were sacred companions, each carrying a purpose, one to purify, one to heal, one to remind the travelers of home. As they gathered, an elder named Cora approached them. Her hair was white as frost, her eyes dark and sharp. "Keeper," she said to Amaru, "the northern path has changed. The storms of last season broke the stone bridge across the gorge. The people fear the crossing." Amaru rested her hands upon her staff. "Then we will not cross it as before," she said calmly. "The land changes its shape, and so must we. The wind does not follow a straight line." Cora studied her, then smiled faintly. "You speak like the sky itself." "The sky is a patient teacher," Amaru replied. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, the village gathered in the open square. Fires were lit, their flames bowing and swaying in the restless air. The elders stood before the people, each carrying a small vessel of wind-borne sand, collected from the outer deserts where few now traveled. These grains, carried by air across great distances, were believed to hold the wisdom of places unseen. Amaru raised her staff and spoke. "The wind returns to remind us that stillness is only a moment in a longer breath. It moves through us, reshaping what we think is fixed. Do not fear its coming, for within movement there is renewal. We walk tomorrow toward the mountains, not to leave home, but to understand it more deeply. Her words carried easily through the crowd, lifted and stretched by the very wind she spoke of. When she fell silent, the people echoed her in unison. The wind remembers. Drums began to sound. Slow, deep beats that matched the rhythm of the air. The Apachu danced, not wildly, but with grace. Their movements were circular, mirroring the spirals of the clouds above. Each step was measured, each gesture deliberate, as though their bodies were extensions of the wind itself. The firelight painted their faces in shifting gold and shadow, and for a moment it was hard to tell where flesh ended and flame began. Tyann moved with them, feeling the rhythm rise from the ground into his feet, up his spine, through his chest. His breath aligned with the beat of the drums, and in that harmony he felt a presence, vast, invisible, and kind. It was the same force that moved the clouds, the same that whispered through the reeds by the river. It was not outside him, he realized, but within. When the dance ended, Amaru approached him. "Do you understand now why the wind returns?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "It comes to remind us that we are never truly still." She smiled. "Yes. To live is to move, not only through space, but through understanding." The fire crackled between them, casting soft sparks into the air. Overhead, the stars began to emerge, countless points of quiet light, flickering like the memory of distant fires. The wind, though gentler now, continued to move through the valley, carrying the echo of their song out into the world. By the time the fires dimmed and the village fell quiet, Amaru stood once more at the terrace edge, looking toward the distant peaks. Their outlines glowed faintly beneath the moonlight. The journey ahead would be long, perhaps difficult, but she felt no fear. The sky had spoken, and the Apachu had listened. The valley was ready to breathe again. The morning of departure came wrapped in a quiet mist. The air was heavy with dew, and the valley of the Apachu glowed faintly beneath a veil of silver. Birds called softly from the treetops, their songs rising like fragile threads into the stillness. The village stood gathered at the river's edge, where the water mirrored both cloud and flame. Amaru stood at the front of the procession, her staff planted gently into the soil. The wind, which had been restless for days, now moved softly around them, as though offering its blessing. Behind her, the travelers were ready, elders, hunters, artisans, and children, each carrying small bundles wrapped in woven cloth. They carried no weapons, only tools of offering, carved stones, vessels of grain, and small fire bowls filled with the coals of their hearths. Tyann adjusted the strap of his pack and looked back toward the village one last time. Smoke still rose from the morning fires, curling lazily into the air. The people who remained, the very old and the very young, stood watching in silence, their faces calm. No one wept. The Apachu did not view departure as loss, but as continuation. The journey was not away from home, but through it. Amaru raised her hand. "The wind has turned," she said softly. "Let us walk with it." The group began to move. The sound of their steps mingled with the rustle of the grass and the quiet murmur of the river beside them. They followed an ancient trail that wound northward, a path older than memory itself. The stones beneath their feet were smooth and pale, worn by centuries of passage. The Apachu called this road the Path of Whispering Stones. It was said that if one walked it with a silent heart, they could hear the earth speak. Tyann walked near the front, his gaze moving between the ground and the horizon. The mist clung to his clothes, cool and soft, The rhythm of footsteps calmed him, and before long, he began to sense what the elders meant when they said the stones whispered. It was not a voice, not in the way humans spoke, but a vibration, a low hum that moved upward through his souls into his bones. It was a sound that carried memory. He slowed his steps, letting himself fall slightly behind so he could listen more clearly. Each stone seemed to hold a tone, and together they created a melody, slow, deep, infinite. It reminded him of the river's pulse, of the fire's crackle, of the wind's rhythm. Different voices, yet one song. Amaru noticed his pause and smiled without turning. "You hear it now," she said. He nodded. "It feels alive." "It is alive," she replied. "Everything that endures learns to speak. The stones carry the footsteps of those who came before us, their hopes, their fears, their offerings. When you walk upon them, they remember." The path began to rise gradually, winding through low hills covered in wild sage and sunlit reeds. The mist lifted, revealing the full expanse of the valley behind them, a vast green bowl encircled by mountains. From this height, the river looked like a silver thread weaving through the land. The sight filled the travelers with quiet awe. Even those who had lived their entire lives in the valley murmured soft prayers of gratitude. As the sun climbed higher, the air grew warm, and the scent of sage mixed with dust and the faint perfume of distant blossoms. Birds followed them for a while, gliding on the same wind that guided the Apachu. The sound of wings became part of the rhythm of their travel. Every element, air, earth, sound, and silence, moved in harmony. Around midday, they reached a narrow gorge where the trail dipped into shadow. The stones here were darker, glimmering faintly, as though holding hidden light. The air was cooler, filled with the scent of minerals and moss. The group slowed, their voices fading into reverent quiet. At the base of the gorge stood a large boulder, shaped like a reclining figure. Its surface was etched with spirals and circles, symbols carved so long ago that even the elders could not say by whom. Amaru approached it slowly, laying her palm against its surface. The stone was warm to the touch, despite the shade. "This is the Heartstone," she said. "Every journey that follows the path must pause here. It listens to our breath, and it carries it forward." One by one, the travelers stepped forward to place their hands upon the stone. Some closed their eyes. Others whispered words of gratitude or hope. When Tyan's turn came, he hesitated for a moment, then pressed his palm firmly to the rock. The warmth surprised him. Beneath his hand, he felt a slow pulse, faint but real. It matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He whispered softly, "May I learn to listen?" The stone gave no answer, yet something within him shifted, as though a door had quietly opened. When all had given their touch, Amaru spoke again. "The Heartstone reminds us that to move forward, we must carry the silence within. The louder the journey, the less we hear of where we are going." The travelers resumed their path, the gorge gradually giving way to open plains. The land stretched ahead in long, rolling waves of color: gold grass, red earth, and blue horizon. In the distance, the mountains rose, veiled in thin clouds that shimmered like smoke. Their peaks caught the light of the afternoon sun, glowing faintly as if lit from within. By evening, they reached a sheltered clearing where the wind moved gently among tall stones arranged in a circle. The elders decided to rest there for the night. Fires were kindled, their flames flickering against the twilight sky. The wind hummed softly through the stones, creating faint tones that harmonized with the crackle of fire. It was as though the land itself sang them to rest. Tyen sat beside Amaru, watching the flames. "Elder," he said, "why does the path sing?" Amaru smiled, her face golden in the firelight. "Because we are not the first to walk it," she said. "The echoes of every journey remain when the wind moves through them. The stones remember the songs that were sung long ago." "Will they remember ours too?" he asked. "Yes," she said softly. "Every step leaves a tone. Even silence becomes part of the song." The boy gazed into the fire, listening to the mingling of sound, the whisper of wind through stone, the hiss of flame, the quiet murmur of the elders. The air was filled with harmony, ancient and tender. For the first time, he felt the truth of Amaru's words, that everything alive was part of a single rhythm, moving through time without end. When the moon rose above the mountains, pale and enormous, the travelers fell into sleep. Only Amaru remained awake, sitting cross-legged beside the dying fire. Her gaze lingered on the stones surrounding their camp. They glowed faintly under the moonlight, as if breathing. She listened, not with her ears, but with her heart, and heard it again, the deep, patient voice of the earth. It spoke not in words, but in presence. It said only this: "Remember." Amaru closed her eyes and smiled. "We will," she whispered. "We always do." The dawn of the third day arrived clear and still. The plains stretched endlessly behind the Apachu, glowing pale gold beneath the rising sun. Ahead, the mountains rose from the horizon like vast sleeping spirits, silent, unmoving, yet deeply alive. Their peaks glimmered faintly, touched by early light, and long ribbons of cloud drifted across their slopes. The air was colder here, thinner, filled with the scent of stone and distant snow. Amaru stood at the edge of the encampment, watching as the wind descended from the high ridges. It carried a sound unlike any she had heard before. Low, steady, almost like breathing. The mountains were exhaling, she thought. The world itself was alive and awake. "The mountain breathes," she murmured, "and we are walking into its lungs." The travelers broke camp quietly. Fires were extinguished, ashes scattered with care, so that no trace would remain. Each person carried their offering stones wrapped in cloth, held close to the chest. The path that led upward was narrow and winding, carved by centuries of wind and rain. It snaked through ridges of red earth, across fields of weathered rock, and between walls of stone marked with faint carvings, spirals, hands, and lines that hinted at stories older than language. Tyen followed close behind Amaru. The climb was steady but difficult, and with each step the air grew thinner. The wind brushed against his face, whispering fragments of sound he could almost understand, like syllables from a forgotten tongue. He remembered the words of his elder, The land does not speak to be heard. It speaks to be felt. So he did not strain to listen with his ears. He let the rhythm of his breath become part of the mountain's breath. Hours passed in quiet ascent. The group moved as one, a long, flowing line of figures against the rising terrain. Shadows lengthened, then softened as clouds drifted overhead. Occasionally, a hawk circled high above them, its cry sharp and brief, a lone voice in the vastness. At midday, the travelers stopped to rest on a high ledge, overlooking the valley they had left behind. The view was immense. The river gleamed far below like a thread of silver, and the village was now just a cluster of tiny shapes, half hidden by distance. The world seemed wider than any of them could have imagined. Tyan sat beside Amaru, catching his breath. "Elder," he said softly, "the air feels alive here. It's as though it moves through me, not just around me." Amaru nodded, smiling faintly. "You are beginning to understand. The mountain breathes through us, as we breathe through it. Every inhalation is an exchange. Our breath for its memory for our life." She reached down and picked up a small piece of quartz from the ground. The sunlight refracted through it, scattering tiny sparks of color across her hand. "This stone was once part of the deep earth," she said. "Now it rests in the open light. The mountain teaches transformation not through words, but through patience." Tyan turned the idea over in his mind. "So when we climb," he said, "we are not just moving upward. We are changing." Amaru's eyes glimmered with quiet pride. "Exactly. Every journey through the world is also a journey through the self." After their rest, they continued upward. The path grew steeper, the ground uneven and slick with loose gravel. The air grew colder still, biting at their hands and cheeks. Yet none complained. Each step was taken with care, each movement deliberate. The Apachu understood that haste had no place in sacred work. By late afternoon, they reached a plateau where the wind howled continuously, echoing between the cliffs. The sound was vast, endless, as if the air itself was singing. The travelers stood in silence, their cloaks whipping around them, listening. The voice of the mountain was everywhere. Amaru raised her staff, its carved end glinting in the light. "Listen closely," she called. "What you hear now is not the storm. It is the breath that binds all living things. It moves through stone and sky alike. It does not belong to the mountain, it is the mountain." Tayan closed his eyes and let the sound surround him. It was not harsh, as he expected, but strangely gentle, a deep vibration that resonated within his bones. He could feel his heartbeat aligning with it, matching its rhythm. The world no longer felt vast and separate, but close and connected. He realized that he was not walking upon the mountain. He was part of its motion. As evening approached, the group reached a narrow pass guarded by two towering pillars of stone. Each was carved with patterns that shimmered faintly in the fading light. The air between them seemed thicker, heavier, filled with an unseen force. Amaru stopped and bowed her head. "This is the gate of breath," she said. "No one crosses without first giving thanks." The Apachu formed a circle before the gate. From her satchel, Amaru removed a small clay bowl filled with glowing coals from the previous night's fire. She placed dried herbs upon them, sage, river mint, and a handful of crushed petals. The smoke rose in a slow spiral, twisting gently upward, before being carried away by the wind. "Breath to breath," Amaru whispered. "From the valley to the peaks, from the living to the unseen. The travelers inhaled deeply together, then exhaled as one. Their breath joined the smoke, merging with the mountain's wind. For a moment, the air shimmered, as if the mountain itself had acknowledged their presence. The sound of the wind shifted in tone, softening into a deep hum. Taian felt a sudden warmth spread through him, though the air was cold. The hum seemed to enter his chest, vibrating within him. It was as though the mountain had lent him part of its breath. When he opened his eyes, the world looked sharper. Every rock, every cloud, every movement of air illuminated from within. They crossed the gate in silence. Beyond it, the trail widened into a vast plateau where thin streams of water glided over smooth stone, catching the dying light of day. The sun dipped low, painting the peaks in crimson and gold. The air was still, except for the soft sighing of the wind between ridges. The mountain breathing its last exhale of daylight. As the travelers set up camp, Amaru stood watching the sky. The stars appeared early at this altitude, clear and near enough to touch. She whispered an ancient verse, a song passed from the first walkers of the path. Block quote, "Breathe the wind that has no name. Walk the road that never ends. Speak the silence that remembers. Be the voice that listens." Tian heard her words and felt something stir inside him. Not fear, not awe, but belonging. He realized then that this journey was not only the fulfillment of tradition, it was the rediscovery of the oldest truth the Apachu held, that the world was alive, and every breath was part of its eternal song. When the night grew deep and the fires flickered low, the travelers slept beneath the stars. Only the wind remained awake, whispering through the stones and across their dreams. It carried a promise that those who walked with open hearts would one day understand the language of all things. And above them, unseen but near, the mountain breathed. The dawn came slow and golden, spilling over the ridges like a quiet promise. The air was thin, almost weightless, yet full of energy, as if each breath carried a secret. The Apachu stirred from their blankets of woven wool, their faces silvered by the morning light. Smoke from the small fires drifted lazily upward, caught in the wind's gentle rhythm. Above them, the peaks loomed clear and near, their summits veiled in drifting mist. Amaru rose before the others and stood facing east. Her long braid shimmered in the light, and her staff cast a thin shadow that pointed toward the distant sky. She inhaled deeply, feeling the crisp breath of the mountain fill her lungs, then exhaled slowly, her breath blending with the cold air. The ritual was simple but sacred, an exchange of life with the world itself. Today, they would reach the Sky Stone. The Sky Stone was not a single rock, but a plateau of ancient stone pillars carved by wind and time. The Apachu believed it was the place where the sky first touched the earth, where the voices of the ancestors still lingered, carried endlessly by the breath of the wind. Every generation made a pilgrimage there, seeking understanding, healing, or simply to listen. By the time the travelers were ready, the sun had climbed above the peaks, bathing the mountainside in soft gold. They walked in silence, their footsteps muffled by the dust of old paths. The trail curved along steep cliffs where narrow ledges gave way to open air. Below, the land fell away in vast shadows. Above, eagles circled, their wings glinting like blades of bronze. Tayan followed close behind Amaru, his eyes wide with wonder. Though the climb was hard, fatigue had little hold on him. Something deeper kept him moving, an unspoken pull, as though the mountain itself had called his name. After hours of steady ascent, they reached a ridge where the path flattened into a wide shelf of pale stone. The wind changed suddenly, stronger now, colder, humming with low vibration. When Tayan looked ahead, he saw it, a vast field of standing stones, scattered like sentinels across the plateau. Some were tall as trees, others no higher than a man's waist. Each was carved with spirals, circles, and lines that glowed faintly in the shifting light. The sky stone. Amaru lifted her staff, and the travelers halted. None spoke. The only sound was the mountain wind, which moved between the stones with a tone that was not quite music, not quite voice. It rose and fell in slow rhythm, echoing against the cliffs. The Apachu stood in silence, listening. Their faces softened, their eyes glimmering with reflection. Tayan felt a tingling at the base of his skull. The sound seemed to move through him, rather than around him. It was a deep resonance, a chord of life itself. He could almost make out words, though they were not words of his tongue. They came as shapes of meaning, feelings without sound. They spoke of time, of creation, of endless motion. Amaru motioned for the group to step forward. Together they entered the field of stones. The wind wove through the pillars like a living thread, changing tone with every shift. The air seemed thick with presence, as though invisible figures moved beside them, unseen but near. At the center of the plateau stood a circular formation of stones arranged around a flat slab, no larger than a bed. Amaru approached it and placed her hand upon its surface. The stone was cool, but beneath that coolness was warmth, faint but steady, like a heartbeat deep within the mountain. "This is the place where the wind remembers," she said softly. "The sky stone listens to those who listen to it. Sit, breathe, and wait for the voices to come." The travelers formed a circle and sat upon the ground, legs crossed, hands resting on their knees. The wind moved gently through the formation, brushing their faces, tugging lightly at their hair. Then it changed, rising suddenly into a swirl that spun around them. The sound became layered, complex. It was no longer just the breath of the mountain. It was many voices, ancient and intertwined. Tayan closed his eyes. The world around him dissolved into sound and rhythm. He saw visions behind his eyelids, rivers flowing backward, stars falling like seeds, forests growing from light. He felt the heartbeat of the world, steady and immense. And within that heartbeat, he heard words, not spoken, but understood. A block quote, "We were here before breath. We will be here after silence. You are not apart from us. You are the echo that remembers." The voices blended into one tone, long and resonant, vibrating through the air. Tears filled his eyes. He did not know why. It was not sadness. It was recognition. The feeling of returning to something he had always known. Amaru watched the travelers quietly. She had heard the voices many times before, but each encounter was different. Today, they seemed stronger, as if the mountain itself was eager to be heard again after long stillness. She lowered her head and whispered a single phrase in the old tongue. "Ashi Kaitorum." "We are still listening." The wind answered with a soft sigh that passed through every stone at once, a harmony so gentle that it felt like touch. For a moment, even the air seemed to shimmer. The sound faded gradually, leaving behind an echo that lingered in the heart more than in the ear. When silence returned, the Apachu remained seated, breathing quietly. No one wished to speak. The silence felt sacred, alive with what had just been. Finally, Tyan opened his eyes and looked to Amaru. "Elder," he whispered, "what were those voices?" She smiled gently. "They are the mountain's memory, and our own. When we listen, the boundary between the two disappears." "So, they are us?" "Yes," she said. "Every word ever spoken, every breath ever taken, leaves a trace. The Sky Stone gathers them. When we come here, we are not learning something new. We are remembering." The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows between the pillars. The light struck the carvings on the stones, and for a brief moment, they seemed to glow from within, the patterns forming shapes like constellations. It was as if the sky had come down to meet the earth. Amaru rose and raised her staff toward the horizon. "The mountain has spoken," she said. "We have heard what we needed to hear. Now we must carry its voice back with us, not in words, but in the way we walk, in the way we breathe." The travelers stood, their faces calm and luminous. Each carried within them a quiet strength, the kind that cannot be seen, but can be felt in the stillness that follows understanding. As they left the plateau, the wind shifted once more, a final farewell, soft and long. It carried faint tones, almost like singing. Taeon turned one last time to look back. The field of stones shimmered in the fading light, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw figures among them. Tall, graceful silhouettes, made of air and memory. When he blinked, they were gone. But the feeling remained. The mountain was alive, and it knew his name. He whispered quietly to himself, "I will remember." The wind, passing close to his ear, seemed to whisper back, "So will we." Evening fell softly upon the mountain plateau. The last light of the sun burned low along the horizon, staining the peaks in colors of copper and rose before fading into blue shadow. The Apachu moved quietly through the encampment, their movements measured and deliberate. Every gesture was part of an unspoken ritual, laying stones in a circle, gathering wood for the fires, spreading woven blankets across the smooth rock floor. When the first flame rose, its light glimmered off the standing stones of the sky plateau, sending faint ripples of gold across their surfaces. Soon, 5 fires burned in harmony, each one small yet bright. Their smoke carried upward in thin spirals that merged with the deepening dusk. Above, the stars began to appear, slow at first, then all at once, until the sky seemed alive with silent fire. The wind quieted. Even the mountain, which had breathed so steadily throughout the day, seemed to hold its breath. Amaru stood at the center of the circle, her staff planted gently into the ground. The carved end glowed faintly in the firelight. Around her, the Apachu sat cross-legged, their faces serene and expectant. Children leaned against their mothers. Hunters and elders sat side by side. There was no hierarchy here, only belonging. She began to speak, not loudly, but clearly enough that her voice carried through the stillness. "We walk upon the skin of the ancestors," she said. "We breathe the air they once breathed. We drink the water that carries their reflection, and when the fire speaks, it is their light that speaks through it. A soft murmur of acknowledgement moved through the group. This was not the first time they had gathered for the Night of the Ancestors, but it was the first time they had done so upon the sacred mountain itself, the place where the sky met the earth. Amaru reached into a pouch at her side and drew out small bundles wrapped in leaves, offerings prepared in the valley long before their departure. Each bundle contained grains, salt, and dried petals from the riverbanks. She handed them out one by one, her hands steady and graceful. "Place your offerings into the fire," she said, "and as the smoke rises, let your thoughts rise with it. Speak to those who came before us, not with your voice, but with your breath." One by one, the Apachu stepped forward. Each person knelt beside the flames, whispering silently as they cast their bundles into the fire. The smoke rose, curling upward in slow, elegant motion. It carried a faint fragrance, sweet and earthy, like rain on dry soil. When the last offering was given, the circle fell into silence once more. Then the wind returned. It came not as a gust, but as a slow, steady movement, weaving through the stones, through the fires, through the people themselves. The flames flickered, but did not die. Instead, they began to lean together, their smoke forming a single, rising column. Within it, faint shapes began to appear, shifting forms made of light and ash. Tayan felt his heart quicken. The shapes moved like dancers, fluid and weightless. For a moment, they seemed to take on human outlines, arms raised, faces gentle, eyes filled with a distant glow. He blinked, and they faded into smoke, but the feeling remained, presence. A soft voice rose from the wind. It was neither man nor woman, neither old nor young. It spoke in the rhythm of breath, not sound. Yet every Apachu understood. "We are the fire that remembers," the voice said. "We are the wind that carries your name. You walk because we walked. You breathe because we breathed." The fires flared brighter. The people bowed their heads. Some wept quietly, not from sorrow, but from the vastness of what they felt. The realization that the boundary between life and memory was thinner than mist. Tayan sat with his hands on his knees, his eyes fixed on the central flame. As he watched, the smoke shifted again, and this time he saw a familiar shape, a tall man with strong shoulders and calm eyes, standing as though carved from the very air. The man raised his hand slowly, palm open, and Tayan's breath caught in his throat. It was his grandfather, the one who had taught him to track the wind through the forest and listen to the call of birds. "Grandfather," he whispered. The figure smiled faintly. The expression was both warm and distant, like sunlight reflected on water. Then, in a voice that was no louder than a heartbeat, the spirit spoke. "You have walked far, little one. Do not rush your knowing. The mountain is not conquered. Dot. It is befriended. Walk with patience and you will see what even the stars forget." Tayan felt tears on his cheeks. He wanted to reach out, but his hands remained still. He understood instinctively that touch was unnecessary. Connection was already there, deeper than flesh, older than time. Nearby, others began to see their own visions. a mother recognizing the laugh of her lost child, an elder seeing the face of her teacher, a hunter glimpsing his brother who had vanished seasons ago. The air was thick with memory, shimmering like heat above sand. Amaru remained at the center, her eyes half closed. She did not look into the fire, she looked through it. The wind moved her hair gently across her face, and the glow of the flames reflected in her calm eyes. When she spoke, her voice joined the wind, not above it, but within it. Ancestors, we thank you. Your journey is not forgotten. Your wisdom breathes within us still. The wind shifted again, softening until it became only a sigh. The flames steadied. The shapes within the smoke began to fade, not vanishing, but dissolving gently back into the world. The stars shone brighter overhead, their cold light mingling with the warm flicker of the fires. The Apachu sat quietly for a long while. No one spoke. The ritual was complete, but its echo lingered. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was fullness, the kind of quiet that comes when every question has found its answer. At last, Amaru lifted her gaze to the sky. "They are not gone," she said softly. "They have only stepped beyond the breath we know. As long as we breathe, they breathe through us." The travelers nodded. Some smiled faintly. Others reached for the hands of those beside them. The firelight played across their faces, the living and the remembered, united in one long, endless heartbeat. When the night deepened and the wind grew cold again, the Apachu lay down beside the dying fires. The last embers glowed red against the dark, pulsing softly like stars fallen to earth. Above, the sky shimmered, vast, patient, eternal. As Tyan closed his eyes, he heard a whisper carried by the fading wind. It was not a voice from outside, but from within. "You are never alone," it said. "We walk beside you, in the breath between each heartbeat." He smiled, his face calm. The mountains sighed once more, and sleep came gently, like the closing of an ancient song. Dawn came quietly upon the mountain. The stars lingered longer than usual, shimmering faintly above the fading line of night. The fires from the night of the ancestors had burned down to soft embers, their smoke rising in thin, graceful threads that mingled with the pale light of morning. A hush lay over the plateau, not the silence of absence, but the silence that follows deep revelation. The Apachu began to stir slowly, like flowers turning toward the first warmth of the sun. Their movements were gentle, unhurried. Some stood and stretched, feeling the cool air brush against their skin. Others remained seated, gazing at the horizon where the light grew brighter, the color shifting from silver to soft rose. Amaru rose last. Her hair glimmered faintly in the dawn. She stood for a moment, her eyes closed, breathing deeply. The air was crisp and thin, filled with the scent of stone, fire, and the faint sweetness of the herbs they had burned the night before. When she exhaled, it was with a quiet smile. "The ancestors have left their echo in us," she said softly. "Now the earth waits for our next step." The people gathered their things in silence. The fires were gently smothered, the ashes scattered to the wind with reverence. Each traveler touched the ground before standing, a small gesture of gratitude to the mountain that had carried their prayers. As they began their descent, the morning light deepened, The peaks above glowed gold, while the valleys below remained blue and shadowed. From above, they could see thin trails of mist coiling like rivers across the lower slopes. Beyond those mists lay the valley of the River of Morning Stars, a place known to the Apachu only through song and legend. It was said that the river flowed not with water alone, but with light, that at dawn, when the stars faded, their reflections lingered on its surface, shimmering like silver scales. The old ones called it Ren, the memory of the sky. Few among the living had ever seen it. Tyen walked beside Amaru, his steps quiet, his mind still half within the dream of the night before. Though the visions of the ancestors had faded, their feeling remained, a warmth that pulsed deep within his chest. Elder, he said softly. When the ancestors spoke, they said we must remember. But what is it we are meant to remember? Amaru's gaze stayed on the path ahead. Not an answer, she said, but a rhythm. The world was born in rhythm, breath and silence, movement and stillness. To remember is to move in harmony with that rhythm again. When we forget, we walk against the world. Her words sank into him like stones settling in a riverbed. He didn't yet understand them fully, but he felt their truth. The mountain wind brushed past, cool and gentle, carrying the faint sound of bells. Perhaps the stones themselves ringing in the distance. By mid-morning, they reached a ledge where the trail widened, revealing the valley below. It was vast and quiet, filled with low mist that glowed faintly in the sunlight. At its heart, winding like a ribbon of light, flowed the river itself. From this height, it truly seemed to carry the reflection of the stars, bright points dancing along its surface, as though the sky had spilled its jewels into the water. Gasps rose softly among the travelers. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared, entranced. Even Amaru closed her eyes for a moment, as though in silent thanks. "This is where the songs were born," she murmured, before words, before memory. The first Apachu learned to listen here. They began the descent carefully. The slope was steep, covered in loose shale, and the twisted roots of mountain shrubs. The sound of their footsteps echoed faintly against the stone walls. With every turn, the river grew larger, its sound rising, a deep, melodic rush that seemed to carry both power and peace. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun stood high, its light filtering through thin clouds. The air here was warmer, softer. The river wound through the plain like a living serpent, its waters glinting silver blue. On either side, tall reeds swayed gently, whispering secrets to the breeze. The Apachu approached the bank with reverence. No one spoke. The water was clearer than any they had ever seen, reflecting the sky so perfectly that it seemed the stars themselves still floated within it. Tyen knelt beside the river and dipped his hands into the flow. It was cold, but not harsh. A clean, living cold that carried the scent of stone and cloud. He brought his hands to his lips and drank. The taste was strange, unlike any river water he had known. Light, almost weightless, with a hint of sweetness that lingered at the back of his tongue. When he looked up, the world seemed brighter, sharper. The edges of every leaf, every ripple glowed faintly. Amaru watched him, nodding slightly. The river of morning stars carries the memory of what has not yet happened, she said. It reminds us that the future is not distant. It flows through us already. The others began to drink as well, each taking only a small handful, each pausing afterward in quiet reflection. It was not merely water they tasted, but presence. Some said later they had heard faint music when they drank, a sound like wind moving through distant bells. Others said they saw faces in the ripples, faces both familiar and unknown. When they had finished, Amaru led them along the river's edge to a small rise where the ground was dry and flat. There they rested, spreading their blankets beneath the shade of thin-barked trees. The day passed slowly, filled with gentle quiet. Some mended clothing, others traced symbols in the dust. A few simply sat, watching the river move. As the sun began to sink once more, the first stars reappeared, faint at first, then gathering strength as twilight deepened. The river caught them instantly, turning into a ribbon of living light. The water shimmered with hundreds of tiny reflections, moving and merging like breathing constellations. Tayan sat at the edge of the river, mesmerized. He felt as though he were watching the heartbeat of the sky itself. "Elder," he whispered, "why do the stars return to the river?" Amaru stood behind him, her voice soft as the evening wind. "Because the sky forgets and the river remembers. When the night comes, they meet again, and balance is restored." She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. The two watched as the river darkened to silver black, its light rippling like a living thing. "Tomorrow," Amaru said, "we will follow the river east to where it disappears into the forest. There we will listen again. The ancestors have spoken. Now the earth will speak." Tayan nodded slowly, though his gaze remained fixed on the shining water. He thought of his grandfather's voice, of the breath of the mountain, of the whispering stones. Each had taught him something, and yet he sensed that none of them were the end. Each was only a step. The stars shifted overhead. The wind carried the faint scent of blossoms from the riverbanks. The Apachu gathered around small fires, their voices low, their songs soft, melodies that blended with the murmur of the water until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. As sleep settled over the valley, the river kept moving, carrying the light of the stars onward, as it always had, as it always would. And somewhere in its current, the world continued to remember. Morning rose gently over the valley. The river of morning stars shimmered in the first light, its surface calm, its song soft and patient. Mist clung to the water like silk, moving slowly as though reluctant to leave. The Apachu stood along the bank, gathering their belongings in quiet purpose. Today, they would leave the river behind and follow its source into the forest, the great eastern wood that stretched farther than any horizon. Amaru stood a moment longer by the water, her eyes tracing the flow that disappeared into the shadows of trees. The air smelled of earth and dew, of beginnings. "The river teaches stillness in movement," she murmured. "Now the forest will teach us listening." Tayan stood beside her, fastening the small bundle that held his bow and flute. He looked toward the forest and felt a strange pull in his chest, both curiosity and unease. The trees looked ancient, their trunks broad, their branches thick with dark green leaves that moved without wind. Between them, the light broke into narrow, trembling lines. It was beautiful, but also deep, a place that held more than it showed. As the Apachu began their journey eastward, the sound of the river faded behind them, replaced by the slow rhythm of footsteps through soft soil. The first trees they passed were tall and straight, their bark pale and smooth. But as the hours passed, the forest deepened. The trees grew older, their roots tangled, their crowns thick with moss. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy in golden spears, illuminating drifting dust that shimmered like tiny spirits. No one spoke for a long while. The quiet was not empty, it was alive. Every leaf seemed to whisper something, every branch to breathe. The deeper they went, the more the forest's voice grew layered, rustling, clicking, humming, like a great heart that beat in rhythm with their steps. Taiyan felt it most strongly. Each sound seemed to hold meaning, though he could not yet understand its words. Sometimes he thought he heard laughter in the leaves. Other times a low murmur that felt almost like warning. At midday, they stopped to rest near a clearing where the sunlight pooled in warm circles on the ground. The forest opened here just enough to let the air move freely. Amaru motioned for the people to sit. She knelt and placed her hand on the earth. "The forest remembers us," she said softly. "Long ago, our ancestors lived within it, before they walked the plains and mountains. These roots have drunk their sweat and their tears. They know our scent, our sound, our dreams." An elder named Suma tilted his head, listening. "Then why does it feel as though it watches us?" Amaru smiled faintly. "Because it does, but not as a stranger would. The forest does not judge. It listens. It waits to see if we still remember its language." Her words lingered. When they rose again to continue, Taiyan found himself walking a little slower, his eyes tracing the patterns in the bark, his fingers brushing the leaves as he cast. He noticed small things: the scent of sap, the sound of droplets falling from branch to branch, the faint hum of insects hidden in the moss. Each detail seemed to pulse with awareness. The trail narrowed as they went deeper. Thick roots twisted across their path, forcing them to move carefully. The air grew cooler, heavy with the smell of earth. Every so often, a flicker of light passed between the trunks. A bird darting through the shadows, or perhaps something else. As dusk approached, they reached a place where the forest floor dipped into a shallow hollow, filled with ferns and stone. There, a single tree stood apart from the others, taller, older, its trunk so wide that 10 people could not have encircled it with their arms. Its bark was dark and ridged like the skin of an ancient creature, and its branches reached upward, as though holding the sky itself. Amaru stopped before it and bowed deeply. The others followed her lead. "This is the heart tree," she said quietly. "It was old when our people were young. The songs say its roots touch the memory of the world." The Apachu gathered in a circle around the base. The ground beneath them felt warm, pulsing faintly as though with breath. Taiyan placed his palm against the bark. It was rough, but beneath the roughness, he could feel movement, slow and steady, like the rhythm of a distant drum. He closed his eyes. For a moment, all sound faded. Then, from deep within the earth, he heard something. Not words exactly, but tones, vibrations, a pattern of sound that echoed through his bones. It felt familiar, like a forgotten melody. When he opened his eyes, Amaru was looking at him. "You heard it," she said softly. He nodded. It sounded like breathing. The forest breathes through us, she replied, and we through it. The ancestors knew this, that life is not divided. The river, the wind, the tree, the heart, all are the same voice, heard through different mouths. The others began to touch the tree as well, each in quiet reverence. Some leaned their foreheads against its trunk. A few wept silently, overcome by the feeling that they were not merely standing near life, but within it. As night descended, they made camp near the heart tree. The forest was never truly dark. Faint lights glimmered among the branches, insects, perhaps, or drops of dew catching the starlight. The air was alive with gentle murmurs. In the distance, a night bird called, its voice long and slow. Amaru sat by a small fire and began to hum an old tune, a song so ancient that no one knew its beginning. The melody rose and fell like wind through hollow wood. Soon others joined in, their voices blending until the air seemed to vibrate softly around them. It was not a song of words, but of tone, a dialogue between human and forest. Tayan listened, his eyes half closed. He thought of how the mountain had spoken through wind and fire, how the river had whispered in its flow, and now how the forest spoke through silence and song. Each voice different, yet all one. When the song ended, the forest responded. The leaves rustled though no wind blew. The ground trembled faintly, not in fear, but in recognition. And then, from somewhere high above, a sound like distant chimes drifted down, the branches of the heart tree brushing against one another, creating a melody of wood and air. The people sat still, listening. They understood. This was the forest answering. Amaru smiled. It remembers. For a long time they stayed in that stillness. The fire crackled softly. The stars blinked through the canopy. Sleep came gradually, wrapping the Apachu in warmth and quiet. The forest watched over them, breathing in rhythm with their dreams. Tayan dreamed of roots stretching like rivers, of branches weaving the sky, of voices speaking through leaves. When he awoke before dawn, the world was silver gray, the air filled with mist. He looked toward the heart tree and thought he saw a faint light pulsing within its trunk. Steady, calm, eternal. He smiled and whispered, "I hear you." And in the hush that followed, the forest seemed to sigh, a sound both vast and intimate, as though it too was whispering back. The dawn came slowly beneath the canopy. Light seeped through the leaves in long, narrow strands, bending and breaking upon the forest floor. The Apachu stirred one by one, rising from their blankets of woven grass and bark. Mist drifted low around their ankles, cool and faintly luminous. The night's quiet lingered, a stillness so complete that even the first songs of birds seemed hesitant to disturb it. Amaru stood beside the heart tree, her hand pressed gently to its bark. She listened for a long time before she spoke. "The forest breathes more deeply today," she said. "It knows we are near the place where its oldest voice sleeps." Tayan looked up at her, blinking the sleep from his eyes. "The place beyond this?" Amaru nodded. "The hidden grove. It lies where the roots of this tree meet the roots of the world. The ancestors called it Sayuna, the Chamber of Whispers. It is not marked by path or stone. It must be found by listening, not looking." The people gathered their things quietly. The heart tree watched in silence, its branches swaying ever so slightly as though in farewell. When they began to walk again, the path was almost invisible. Faint impressions in the moss, occasional breaks in the undergrowth. The air grew warmer as they went, filled with the deep, sweet scent of resin and wildflowers. Hours passed without a word. It was as though the forest had drawn them into a world apart from sound. Even their footsteps seemed to fade before they could be heard. Yet around them, life was everywhere. Birds moving unseen above, insects humming beneath the soil, leaves whispering against one another in secret conversation. At midday, they stopped beside a small stream. The water ran clear and cold, winding between rocks covered in green velvet moss. The Apachu drank and rested. Tyan knelt by the edge, watching the way the water curved around his fingers. Beneath the surface, he saw reflections that did not quite match the world above. Shadows that seemed to move on their own, as though the forest were watching from beneath the surface. He looked up at Amaru. "How will we know when we've found the grove?" She smiled faintly. "The forest will know first. When it stops watching and begins listening, that is when we will have arrived." Her answer puzzled him, but he said nothing more. They continued on, following the sound of the stream deeper into the woods. By afternoon, the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisting like braided ropes. The air was dense with the scent of roots and damp earth. A soft light glowed through the mist, not sunlight, but something gentler, as if the forest itself was generating its own light from within. Then the sound began. At first it was faint, a distant murmur, almost like wind moving through distant reeds. But as they walked, it grew clearer, separating into tones and layers. Some were low, like the rumble of a drum beneath the earth. Others were high, like the sigh of a flute carried on the wind. Together, they formed a melody that was not music in the human sense, but something older, a pattern that moved in rhythm with breath, with heartbeat, with life itself. The Apachu slowed their pace. Every face turned upward, listening. The forest was singing. Tyan felt the sound vibrate through his chest. Each step seemed to bring the melody closer, until he could no longer tell whether it came from around him or from within him. The air shimmered faintly, and the path curved suddenly, revealing a clearing ahead. A wide circular space, surrounded by massive trees, whose roots coiled above the ground like the arms of sleeping giants. The hidden grove. The air here was different, thick but luminous, heavy yet filled with motion. Threads of golden mist wove between the trunks, rising and falling as though breathing. In the center stood a pool, perfectly still, reflecting the canopy above. And from everywhere, the sound of the forest song continued. Soft, steady, alive. No one spoke. They moved forward slowly, reverently, as though stepping into a sacred dream. Amaru knelt at the edge of the pool and placed her hand upon its surface. Ripples spread outward, bending the reflection of the trees and sky. "Here," she said softly, "the voices of the first Apachu still dwell. Their breath lingers in the roots, Their words ride upon the water. Listen, and they will remember us. The people sat in a circle around the pool. The sound of the forest deepened. The wind shifted, weaving through branches in long, melodic sighs. The pool began to glow faintly, its surface shining with soft silver light. Within it, shapes began to form, faint outlines of faces, not distinct, but familiar, like the memory of a dream. Tyan felt something stir in his chest, a pulse, a call. He leaned closer to the water and whispered, "Who are you?" A faint voice, no louder than breath, rose from the ripples. "We are what you have forgotten. We are the sound before speech, the song before music. We are the silence that shaped your words." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was a chorus, a harmony of tones woven into one. The pool shimmered brighter for a moment, then dimmed again, its light fading back into stillness. Amaru's eyes remained closed. She had heard it too. "The forest does not speak in words," she said. "It remembers in vibration. Each step we take, each breath we give, it records them, not as story, but as rhythm. The hidden grove is the memory of the world's heartbeat." Tyan sat back, his heart calm, yet filled with wonder. Around him, the Apachu sat in silent communion. The forest's song continued, low and steady. Some began to hum softly in response, not to mimic, but to join. The two sounds, human and forest, merged seamlessly, creating something vast and peaceful. Time seemed to lose meaning. The sun might have moved or stood still. None could tell. They remained there, caught between worlds, listening to the breath of the living earth. When at last the light began to fade, Amaru rose. She looked around the grove, her expression serene. "It has accepted us," she said quietly. "Now we must leave before our presence becomes echo. To stay too long would make us part of the song, and not of the world." The Apachu rose without question. They left the grove as they had entered, slowly, silently, with gratitude. When they passed beyond the ring of ancient roots, the forest song softened, fading into the whisper of leaves. As they walked back toward their camp, Tyan looked over his shoulder one last time. Through the trees, he thought he saw the faint glow of the pool, a silver eye, half hidden in shadow. It seemed to pulse once, like a slow heartbeat, before vanishing completely. He turned back to the path, his steps steady. The sound of the forest lingered in his ears, a quiet rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. And in that rhythm, he understood. The world was alive, not because it moved, but because it listened.